Today, we are going to be discussing some really interesting sort of areas for young people who are going to be the main participants of the Young People Summit that is due to take place in Malta at the beginning of November. And given your background, legal background, and your transition from law to technology, and especially to artificial intelligence, it's really interesting for the audience and especially for young people, startups, to hear about your experience. So if you can just sort of start by telling us a little bit about your background and how did you transition from law to tech, etc. Thank you.
Hi, Nina. Thank you for having me. I appreciate the invite. So I think it all started through the intersection of these two worlds, the communication world and the computation world, which were both very exciting to me. I think as a child, I was very curious about sort of how systems work, whether these systems were linguistic systems, legal systems, or technical systems. And although I trained as a lawyer, my doctoral degree is in IT law, I think I always found myself very much drawn to patterns, patterns of logic, patterns of structures, of argumentation, and information flows. And at some point in time in my career, I sort of realized that technology was really becoming sort of the new language of our time, of our generation. So I moved into digital innovation after informatics, and I think to me, this really meant how do we redesign? How do we rethink how humans engage? How do they engage with legal systems? How do they engage with each other? How do they find meaning in what they do? And I think this ultimately is what drew me into my present mission, which is using AI in healthcare. I wasn't really driven by technology itself. I think I was very much driven by this idea that we need to rethink the patient experience at scale. We need to rethink how public service works, how we can remove the friction between the citizen and the state. How can we give patients more dignity? How could we sort of rehumanize work? So maybe at my very core, my journey has been about sort of finding flaws in the system and building better ones.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for such an interesting answer and setting the tone to our discussion. So I'm going to lean towards sort of more legal questions now because I'm going to take the opportunity of talking to a lawyer. Where do you see the biggest privacy risks when it comes to sort of AI today, especially in conversational AI? Because this is a big challenge for lawyers and for lawmakers in general across the world. The European Union has obviously taken a different approach, and the US has taken a different approach. So we see a lot of contrast across the pond, so to speak. But the truth is that as a lawyer, I speak from my experience. I mean, the genie's pretty much out of the bottle. So law is finding it difficult to keep up with the ever-changing tech, because tech is changing at the speed of light, and the provisions, the legal provisions that we've traditionally seen are either outdated or they are just not broad enough to cover everything that's going on. So in terms of your experience, if we can focus on privacy, because that's a big issue when it comes to AI, what do you see as the biggest risks?
Let's start by defining conversational AI, because what you quoted is just one of the many branches of the AI remit. So, conversational AI is the ability of a human to converse in natural language with an AI artifact, whether that be text or voice or through any particular channel, in a bi-directional and very engaging way. So, I think the biggest privacy risks in conversational AI can really be probably summarized in five major buckets. I think the first bucket, Nina, is unseen data harvesting, right? So every conversation which AI holds contains data. And there is a large risk that organizations can collect more data than they need. So not just what you're saying to the AI artifact, but how you are saying it, your tone, your pauses, even the inferred emotions from that conversation. So that first privacy risk is all about moving conversational AI away from service and into surveillance. And that is a privacy risk. The second bucket relates to this concept of inference, right, at scale. So conversational AI isn't just recording information. All conversational models are actually predicting, right? So what they're doing is they're triangulating different fragments of data, right? And then trying to infer context. Or in the case of healthcare, you perhaps are trying to infer a health condition. Or in the case of financial services, you might be trying to infer financial stress or opportunity to sell. Or, of course, let's say political views. So here you have a situation whereby your end user, your citizen, is not explicitly disclosing information, yet the tool is creating a privacy risk, which goes well beyond traditional data breach theory by inferring at scale and then perhaps utilizing that inference towards a particular goal. So that might be advocacy, influence, or even manipulation. I think that's a risk which we haven't understood well enough because it's very much outside the parameters of traditional privacy law context. I think the
No,
third,
absolutely. Yeah.
Nina, go ahead.
No, no, no. Sorry. Please go ahead. Yes. The
I'd
third
say
point that you.
probably the third bucket, which I often come across, relates to consent. This is a traditional area of privacy law, which today we understand very well, but I still see too many applications which have very weak boundaries around consent. So, most citizens just don't read the T's and C's. They don't truly understand how their conversational data is going to be stored, it's going to be shared, it's going to be monetized. And I think we need to move towards enterprise whereby clearer consent frameworks, right? Because otherwise, we're going to be turning private speech with an AI system into a public commodity. And I think problem. The fourth major bucket, I think, is data. So we often fail to understand that unlike human conversation, right, human to human conversation over a coffee table, and that fades after a while, even from memory. AI conversations persist, right? They are logged, they are stored, they are retrievable. So I think the permanence of digital memory is making these type of what we consider to be private interactions with AI vulnerable and vulnerable long after the moment of interaction has passed. So this replay of data and this persistence of data is, I think, a fourth privacy risk. And maybe to end with a fifth large one, which has massive impact in terms of commerce and intellectual property, it's these opaque models which we have in conversational AI. So when a large language model LM learns from user input, it's actually not always clear, right? Whether that input is going to later, let's say, reappear in an unintended context. We don't know what weight that conversational input has in the machine learning model in general. And I feel it undermines user trust if end users feel that sort of their private conversations might resurface elsewhere. So you see, Nina, privacy in AI isn't just about compliance, because in conversational AI, it's about dignity, right? Because conversations are really one of the most intimate human acts. So if AI is going to mishandle conversations, then what we're just losing is not privacy, but we're losing the ability to hold human dialogue itself.
No, absolutely. I think that's probably one of the big concerns that, we don't know how the data, as you said, how long it's stored and how, in what context it will resurface. And also, that's why we are time and time told again about the usage of AI in professional context, not to share sort of sensitive data. But again, you still feel uncomfortable even if you're not sharing sensitive data per se, naming sort of company name, etc. You still feel really uncomfortable about sharing sort of the details that could be precise enough to make the data identifiable. So it's a dilemma between sort of you don't want to hinder the tech development, but at the same time you don't want to violate basic human rights like right to privacy, right to private life, etc. So I think it's a
Right.
balancing act, but it's very difficult balancing act. And I think the US has taken a more relaxed approach from what we've seen, and the European Union is trying to be more proactive when it comes to sort of segregating the risk associated with AI system and AI Act. And also, it's just not clear how much the AI developers and the companies have understanding or are willing to comply, because it's a little bit like platform responsibility issue. We've seen time and time again, big platforms, social media platforms being held accountable for the failure in content moderation. But it's not, the legislation is not harmonized across the world. Like, it's different everywhere you go. Germany has network enforcement acts, and then the UK has its own legislation, but then in the US they err more on the side of freedom of expression. So it's difficult, when it comes to digital, it's difficult, and especially when it comes to AI. So that brings me to my next question, which is I think you've sort of partially answered this, but if there's anything that you would like to add, just because this concerns sort of healthcare and sensitive data, um, I mean, what kind of did you need in advance of implementing the system that is so useful and so successful? Was there sort of any training or literacy campaign that you needed to put in place in order to convince sort of the end receiver or the beneficiary that this is the right system for healthcare, because you handle so much sensitive data?
Yeah, so I think in healthcare, the risks are, let's say, heightened by the fact that you're always dealing with sensitive data. So it's not just numbers, right? It's literally people's lives, people's fears, and people's dignity. So I think the foundational principle which you start with internally, so with your engineering team, with your product team, is that all the automation initiatives that you take on need to begin with a very singular mindset, and that is that patients own their data. It starts off with that. It starts off from the right of ownership, from understanding that that all stems from ownership in data. I think then what it means is that you implement a sort of a privacy by design and default approach, right? So when you're engineering your systems, you're thinking about things like encryption or role-based access or sort of strict audit trails. You're not doing that as an optional add-on to be able to end, but it's literally its core architecture. So it's kind of building trust in an ever-present method through your different sprints and engineering initiatives. I think when it comes to maybe just core guidelines that have really guided our own commercial activity, we've always been very focused on the concept of minimalism, in the idea of, you're only collecting strictly the data that is absolutely necessary. So if the automation process doesn't need this health data, just don't ask for it, right? So patients should never feel that they are sort of trading their data for efficiency, right? And that kind of also leads us to another principle, which has been very prevalent in our work, which is this idea of transparency and explainability. So with conversational AI products in health, you've got the opportunity to explain in plain language what the AI is doing with the data, right? So a patient is more likely to trust a system and eventually adhere to a care plan if they can see the why, right, behind the system. So I think that has been an important guiding point for us. We've been quite focused on human oversight. So we always have, accountable humans in the loop. And of course, when it comes to the clinical process, you've got final clinical judgment done by a human being, which I think has been sort of a guiding light for us from the start, focusing on this concept of agency. And I think what has been a commercial pivot more than a legal one is that we saw ethics to be a competitive advantage. So for us, AI ethics in healthcare wasn't simply about compliance, I think it was a differentiator. So we compete often with entities coming from, different parts of the world who have different value-based systems. I think we have this very strong European character, and the systems we build have a very core European, if you wish, respect for dignity, right? And this has given us a competitive advantage in the way we access, retrieve data, store it, process it. All these guiding principles have actually given us higher levels of adoption within European states because our ethics framework is much better aligned to not only policy and regulation, but also the expectations of European professionals.
Absolutely. No, absolutely. That's really interesting to hear about your sort of experience through your company. So, in terms of legislation, do you think it's achievable? What we've been sort of touching upon that. Do you think it's achievable for European Union to achieve harmonization of legislation across border, at least in Europe? And do you think legislation is the right way to deal with this ever-changing situation, or do you think it's a combination of legislation as well as sort of media literacy and awareness raising? People like young people's, events like Young People's Summit, where we will be discussing the legal angle to the usage of AI as well, and disinformation risks, propaganda, etc. So, do you think it should be like combination of law as well as education, or do you think law is just too inadequate or outdated to keep up with the changes?
So I think the short answer is that we're not going to get to a single sort of global code of AI privacy, right? Although that might be desirable, and I'm widening it intentionally beyond Europe because most healthcare projects are multinational, where you get specialists operating on the same data file from a large amount of different countries. No, I don't think we're going to get to a global code of AI privacy. But what we probably can do, Nina, and I think this is a realistic goal, is get a global floor with
Mm-hmm.
local flavors, sort of a common baseline of principles, and then regional implementation of often regulation or guidelines, which are, let's say, pragmatic. And I think just to dive a little bit deeper into your question, so there are two angles. Firstly, why does fragmentation persist? And then where we are seeing convergence happening. So let's start with the first part. I think fragmentation in this space still exists because if you just elevate to the macroeconomic level of analysis, Nina, the truth is data is power, right? And geopolitics is all about understanding that sovereignty, whereby states want to prioritize their security, they want to prioritize their industrial policy, and there are different and divergent rules that remain applicable. So, even the UN High-Level Advisory Board on AI is explicitly understanding that this transboundary nature is what underscores sort of these national initiatives, which are fragmenting this sort of global code. I think there's also another reality which is leading to this fragmentation, and that's the complexity of sectors. Healthcare looks very different to finance, which looks very different to tourism, which looks very different from, I don't know, automotive activity. So each of these industries have these different safety or requirement layers. So you need higher assurance in some sectors than you need in others. So a one size fits all is unrealistic. So even if you look at the work done in the World Health Organization, there is more of guidance around sort of life cycle risk management than
Mm-hmm.
there is sort of chasing this objective of unitary regulation. And there's also another reality, which is regulatory activity in every continent has a little bit of a cadence, right? So the EU AI Act has its own cadence and it advances specific concepts like, risk-based regimes, whilst other territories, other continents are moving more towards, let's say, guidance or sectoral law. So this sort of cadence structure is going to be another reason why you have fragmentation. But not all is lost. We are seeing much more convergence at floor level policy than one can imagine. So, for example, we have a lot of principle level alignment. So, I don't know, the OECD AI principles, let's say human centricity, transparency, accountability, fairness, privacy. They echo what the World Health Organization has said for the last decade, which in turn echoes what the Council of Europe's Framework Convention has said about non-discrimination, privacy, oversight, accountability. So I think we do have now our de facto common grammar, right, in the privacy legislation, and that is convergence. I'm also seeing a lot of operational baselines. So when we're doing work in Europe or Africa or the States, we always come across the same AI buyer guides or AI best practices, which are kind of standardizing minimum privacy standards, minimum security standards, usability requirements. And often these sort of guides are templates which are adopted by buyers, whichever continent you're in. And that operational baseline is interesting. And even if you have to think of it as this global floor, I think we are starting to codify shared minimum standards, I don't lawful basis of processing data, minimization, purpose, limitation, the necessity of having DPIAs, data protection impact assessment reports, auditability. These are soft law coordination initiatives, often pushed by supra entities like the UN, the OECD, and so on. And they are allowing us to create a global flow, which then regions can layer on top. So I guess, Dina, my answer in short is this: don't bother chasing a one world law. It's something to exist, but we can build a one world floor. And we're seeing it happening. And we're seeing regions then sort of slowly raising the bar, raising the ceiling on top of that floor. And that floor today is all about interoperability, principles, continuous oversight, portable proof, lawful basis, and that's coming together nicely.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting way of looking at things, sort of more fragmented rather than one as a whole and more decentralized, so to speak, so that the local context and regional considerations are taken into account as well. So I think the initiatives that we see at state level are really interesting, are giving really interesting shade to the whole field. And that brings me to the final question. You as a very successful entrepreneur with legal background, and a lot of young people are moving towards away from traditional education towards business and startup. We see this time and time again, and a lot of them have innovative ideas. But then again, I think the last time I read the statistics, it was that sort of 9 out of 10 startups fail because of one reason or another, because it's not just about the idea, it's also about the commitment, the fundraising, success, investment. It's a whole bunch of things to be considered. But as I'm sure young people will be watching this podcast very closely, what would be your advice to startups, and how can they succeed in this very difficult and competitive environment?
Firstly, I think we need to recognize that it should be hard. I mean, many startuppers, lament the fact that it's just so difficult, that you require so much resilience and grit. But what I say is, this is actually the way it should be. It should be hard. If it did not, knock you out, if it did not exhaust you, then there would be no value in it, and everyone would do it. So I think we need to start off by realizing that this is a type of journey which messes with you. But then you look back after 10 years and you say, look, I'm a better person for having done this because I learned new skills. But then there are also maybe some other tidbits which you learn along the way. And I think the first one is, zooming into your purpose, not your data. earlier on. And this really ties into the discussion we had about compliance, right? So you don't collect data just because you can. I think you need to ask yourself, what is this startup really trying to achieve? What is the problem we are really trying to solve? And starting with why, incidentally, a really great book by Simon Sinek, starting with purpose, not the data, is a really useful guide for startups. Another one is perhaps what we spoke about earlier in terms of privacy, that you really need to bake privacy into the design of your idea because it's going to be much cheaper to do that than retrofitting privacy. But more importantly, it will give you a moat. It's going to give you a competitive advantage. I think it's also about making sure that sort of you're keeping humans in your team accountable. This is not only good, sound privacy legal theory, but it's really useful to always define who in your team is responsible for, let's say, data ethics, for compliance, for your P&L, for your go-to-market. And in startups, Nina, accountability often gets lost and gets lost in speed and confusion and the excitement of starting. But regulators are going to come knocking at some point. Your shareholders and investors are going to keep knocking. So, you need that principle of accountability towards goals as key currency within the organization. Lose it, and you've lost your market.
Yeah, absolutely. Accountability and, also, I guess I've seen a lot of startuppers who have um, no interest in the idea in which they are going into. So just because they think the idea works, but they are not personally passionate about it. And that's also can be a challenge because unless you are very involved and you understand sort of the workings, or at least have a wish to understand the workings of the system. And if the passion is not there, it's really difficult to succeed in this competitive environment. So I completely understand what you're saying, and I hope that this advice will be widely shared amongst our listeners as well. Thank you so much, Dr. Gatt. We hope to see you at the Young People Summit upcoming in Malta, and it's been really, really interesting talking to you.
Thank you, Nina. Have a good day.
Thanks.